Before the dollar anchored the world economy, before sterling financed the British Empire's expansion across 4 continents, there was silver. And for 3 centuries, it moved in one direction, toward China. The Chinese economy functioned as the gravitational center of global monetary flows, pulling silver out of the Americas, out of Japan, out of the Persian Gulf, in quantities so large that historians estimate China absorbed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the silver mined in the New World between 1500 and 1800. Not because China conquered anyone, not because it projected military power across the Pacific, but because the structure of its economy made silver the only thing the rest of the world could offer that China actually wanted. And when an economy that large decides it needs something, the rest of the world reorganizes itself to supply it. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The Ming Dynasty didn't set out to control global currency flows. It set out to collect taxes. That distinction matters enormously because it reveals something the standard narrative of monetary power always gets backward. We tend to imagine currency dominance as the product of deliberate strategy. A hegemon, consciously, constructing the architecture of international exchange to serve its interests. What the Chinese case shows is that monetary dominance can emerge entirely as a byproduct of domestic administrative decisions. The mechanism doesn't require intent. It only requires scale. And this is a pattern worth filing away, because it repeats across monetary history with uncomfortable regularity. In the early 15th century, the Ming government made a decision that would reshape the architecture of world trade for 400 years. They abandoned the paper money system inherited from the Yuan dynasty and mandated that taxes be paid in silver. Not silk, not grain, not the bronze coins that had circulated through Chinese markets for centuries. Silver. This wasn't ideological positioning, it was bureaucratic pragmatism. The paper currency system had collapsed under sustained inflation. Silver was durable, portable, divisible, and difficult to counterfeit at scale. It was a practical choice made by administrators trying to stabilize state revenue in an empire that spanned something like 15% of the world's inhabited land surface. But practical choices made at that scale produce structural consequences that extend far beyond their original intent. When the Ming state required silver for tax payments, every farmer, merchant, landowner, and craftsman in a civilization of 60 to 80 million people suddenly needed silver, not as a luxury or a status marker, as a fundamental survival mechanism. You paid your taxes in silver, or you faced the full weight of imperial enforcement. That demand signal, vast, institutionalized, non-negotiable, radiated outward through every trade network touching China. And here is what made it extraordinary. China produced almost no silver domestically. Its mines were modest. Its deposits were thin compared to the scale of institutional demand. The empire that needed silver most had almost none of its own. That gap between vast institutional demand and near-zero domestic supply is the engine of everything that followed. It created a structural vacuum, and trade networks, then as now, moved to fill structural vacuums. Any economy that could produce silver or acquire it and bring it to Chinese markets could exchange it for goods commanding enormous prices elsewhere. The incentive was automatic and self-sustaining, no treaty required, no military arrangement needed. The price differential did all the organizational work. By the mid-1500s, 2 silver pipelines had been constructed, one crossing the Pacific, one arcing through Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, and both terminated in China. The Pacific route was the more dramatic of the two in terms of sheer volume and geographic ambition. Spanish colonizers had discovered enormous silver deposits at Potosí in present-day Bolivia in 1545, and at Zacatecas in Mexico the following year. The scale of what they found was staggering even by modern standards. By 1600, Potosí alone was producing roughly half the world's silver supply, extracted through a system of forced indigenous labor called the mita that conscripted entire village populations into the mines on a rotating basis. The human cost was catastrophic. The output was extraordinary. That silver moved overland to the Pacific coast, loaded onto the Manila galleons, enormous vessels of up to 2,000 tons, and crossed the ocean to the Spanish colonial port of Manila in the Philippines. There it was exchanged, with remarkable consistency, for Chinese goods: silk, porcelain, tea, lacquerware, fine cotton textiles, items that commanded prices in European and Latin American markets that bore almost no relationship to their cost of production in China, because European manufacturers simply couldn't replicate the quality at comparable prices. The arbitrage was structural, not accidental. The arithmetic of that exchange tells the story in the clearest terms. Spanish merchants in Manila discovered they could acquire Chinese goods for silver at rates that yielded profits of 200 to 300% when those goods were resold westward. Chinese merchants discovered they could sell their manufactures for silver at rates that exceeded anything available in domestic trade by a factor of several times. Both sides had overwhelming incentives to keep the system running. The Manila galleon trade, which operated from 1565 to 1815, 2.5 centuries of continuous operation, transferred an estimated 40,000 tons of silver from the Americas to Asia. The majority ended up in China. The second pipeline ran through the older Indian Ocean system. Portuguese traders, then Dutch, then English, found the same asymmetry operating throughout Southeast Asian and Indian markets. Chinese merchants operating out of Fujian and Guangdong had built trade networks stretching from Japan, itself a significant silver producer, down through the Indonesian archipelago and the Malay Peninsula. Japanese silver, extracted in substantial quantities from the Iwami Ginzan mines, discovered in 1526, and producing an estimated 200 metric tons per year at peak output, flowed into this network and converged with the Pacific Stream. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, became the dominant conduit for much of this flow in the early 17th century, systematically routing silver through Batavia, present-day Jakarta, and into Chinese commercial networks through the diaspora merchants who maintained connections across the entire regional system. By the early 17th century, the silver flowing into China annually was equivalent in weight to several times the entire monetary stock of most European states. Notice what this means structurally. The Spanish crown was running the largest mining operation in human history at enormous human cost, in some of the most brutal labor conditions ever recorded, and a substantial portion of the output was being transferred through voluntary market exchange into the Chinese imperial economy. The Chinese state didn't need a navy in the Pacific. It didn't need colonial garrisons in the Americas or administrative control over the mining operations. The structure of relative prices did the organizational work automatically. This is what monetary dominance looks like when it operates through market mechanisms rather than coercion. It doesn't announce itself. It simply persists, year after year, decade after decade, because the incentives that sustain it remain intact. Remember this mechanism. It becomes important when we examine how it eventually broke. Every monetary system carries the seed of its own disruption. The fractures in China's silver order came from multiple directions, and they didn't arrive simultaneously. They accumulated across a century before the architecture finally gave way. The first pressure point was Japan. By the 1630s, the Tokugawa shogunate had grown alarmed at the pace of silver outflow and the influence foreign traders were accumulating in Japanese ports. The response was a gradual but deliberate closure, limiting foreign exchange to designated ports, cutting off direct European access to Japanese silver, and eventually reducing the overall volume of external trade to a trickle of what it had been. The Japanese pipeline thinned considerably. It didn't shut entirely, but the structural contribution to China's silver supply dropped in ways the broader system couldn't easily absorb. The second pressure point was internal to China itself. The Ming dynasty was unraveling under a combination of fiscal crisis, a prolonged drought and cooling cycle associated with what climate historians now call the Little Ice Age, and a cascade of regional rebellions that fractured central administrative authority. The Manchu-led Qing dynasty replaced the Ming in 1644, but the transition involved decades of destabilizing military conflict across significant portions of the country. Silver flows don't move smoothly through collapsing state structures, and the institutional demand mechanisms that had made China the world's monetary sink required a functioning administrative apparatus to operate. The third pressure point was the most structurally significant, and it's the one that receives the least attention in conventional monetary history. The Spanish crown, perpetually short of revenue to finance its European wars, the 30 Years' War, the wars with the Dutch Republic, the endless fiscal drain of maintaining empire, began debasing the silver content of its coins. The famous pieces of 8, the reales de a ocho that had circulated throughout the entire global trading system as a de facto international currency, began to contain less and less actual silver beneath their stamped denomination. Chinese merchants, who had developed sophisticated assaying techniques over generations of dealing with silver of varying purity, detected the debasement quickly. They began demanding more coins per transaction to account for the reduced silver content. They started insisting on direct weight measurement rather than face value. Trust in Spanish colonial currency eroded. The automatic mechanism of exchange became more friction-filled, more contested, and, critically, less predictable. When the medium of exchange becomes unreliable, the entire architecture of trade built around it begins to recalibrate. Each of these disruptions was individually survivable. The system had enough momentum, enough built-in incentive to absorb single shocks. Together, compounding across 6 decades from roughly 1620 to 1680, they destabilized a monetary architecture that had been built on the assumption of steady, predictable silver inflows. The Qing dynasty made serious attempts to manage the resulting turbulence, restructuring tax collection, developing more sophisticated credit instruments, expanding the role of copper coinage in domestic circulation, and fostering the growth of regional banking networks centered in Shaanxi, a province that could intermediate exchange without requiring physical silver transfers. But monetary systems, once destabilized, don't restore themselves through administrative adjustment alone. They require either a restoration of the underlying conditions that created their stability or a wholesale structural transformation. The Qing got neither. Here is what's rarely taught about this transition. China didn't lose its monetary dominance because a stronger power defeated it in direct competition. It lost it because the structural incentives shifted, and the architecture that had made silver flow inward began, slowly and then, with accelerating force, to work in reverse. The pivot arrived in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in the form of a commodity the British East India Company had spent decades cultivating in the fields of Bengal: opium. The company faced exactly the same structural problem Spanish traders had faced 2 centuries earlier. It wanted Chinese goods, silk, tea, porcelain, but had almost nothing China wanted in exchange. Britain's manufactured goods didn't command price premiums in Chinese markets. Silver was one answer, and silver did flow from Britain to China through the early decades of Qing-era trade. But the company's directors were searching for an alternative, a commodity China would pay for in silver rather than a commodity China would accept in lieu of silver. Opium had an unusual structural property as a commodity. Demand for it, once established at sufficient scale, became self-reinforcing in ways that normal goods did not. It didn't respond to price signals the way silk or tea did. It created its own demand. The company expanded cultivation in Bengal through the 1780s and 1790s, developed distribution networks through licensed private traders, the so-called country traders, to maintain plausible legal deniability, and watched as consumption in Chinese coastal cities grew from a limited luxury practice concentrated among elites to something approaching a mass phenomenon in southeastern port cities. By the 1820s and 1830s, the flow of silver in the Canton trading system had reversed. China was exporting silver to pay for opium rather than receiving silver in exchange for manufactures. The gravitational architecture that had structured global monetary flows for 3 centuries had been turned inside out by a single engineered commodity. The Qing government, alarmed by both the social consequences of widespread addiction and the accelerating drain of silver reserves, attempted to suppress the trade. Commissioner Lin Zexu's confiscation and destruction of over 1,000 tons of opium in 1839 precipitated the First Opium War, a conflict that was, at its structural core, a contest over which direction silver would move and which system of rules would govern the terms of global exchange. Britain's military victory didn't just open Chinese ports to foreign commerce, it imposed a new monetary logic. The treaty system that followed integrated Chinese trade into the sterling-denominated global economy Britain was constructing, with exchange rates, tariff structures, and legal frameworks that systematically disadvantaged Chinese merchants operating under the old rules. Silver didn't stop mattering in China. It remained central to domestic monetary life well into the 20th century, and the silver standard persisted in various forms until 1935. But it no longer defined the gravitational architecture of global trade. That function migrated westward to London, and then, after 2 world wars had exhausted the sterling system, across the Atlantic. So it wasn't really about silver at all. Silver was the instrument. The underlying mechanism was something older and more persistent, the structural advantage that accrues to the economy whose preferred unit of account becomes the denominator of international trade. The economy whose domestic currency, or in China's case, whose institutionalized demand for a specific monetary metal, becomes the medium that other economies must acquire before they can participate in global exchange. That's not leverage in the military sense, it's leverage in the structural sense, the kind that operates through market incentives rather than coercion, the kind that's far more durable as a result, and far more difficult to dismantle because dismantling it requires not just defeating the dominant power, but restructuring the incentive architecture that makes everyone else want to play by the dominant system's rules. The Qing loss of that position required a specific and unusual combination of circumstances. Internal fragility compounding across decades, external military pressure at a moment of institutional weakness, and crucially, a commodity deliberately engineered to reverse the direction of monetary flow. And what's remarkable isn't that the system eventually broke. What's remarkable is how long it held, sustained across 3 centuries of enormous global disruption, through regime changes and climate shocks and the rise and partial fall of multiple European empires, maintained not by military projection but by the internal logic of comparative advantage and institutionalized demand. The pattern this history traces, a dominant economy's monetary preferences structuring global trade, other economies reorganizing their production and exchange networks to accumulate the favored Medium, that dominance eventually challenged by a rival willing to deploy unconventional instruments at the precise moment of structural weakness, is not a pattern that belongs only to the 16th century. The actors change, the commodity changes, the geography changes, the architecture is recognizable, which leaves one question genuinely worth sitting with. When a monetary architecture that has organized global trade for generations begins to lose its internal coherence, what determines which direction the new one flows? History suggests the answer isn't military strength alone, it isn't economic size alone, it isn't even the sophistication of financial instruments, though that plays a role. It's the ability to make your preferred unit of account the medium that everyone else needs to acquire before they can fully participate in the dominant trading system. China figured that out 400 years before Bretton Woods. The question is not whether that structural lesson has been learned by the powers positioning themselves in today's monetary landscape. The question is whether they've read this particular chapter carefully enough to understand what dismantling such a system actually requires, and what it costs the party that tries. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.